Turn on the news, you hear things like, labor market is unprecedentedly strong. And I want us to think for a moment about what that means. Is it true? And then if it's not true, how do we reconcile things like the unemployment rate being very low with some of the patterns I'm going to show you today? So what you got here is a picture of the employment to population ratio of 25 to 54-year-old men. I'm going to use the word prime age from now on to refer to people post-bachelor's degree-ish, pre-retirement-ish, so in the ranges of 20s to mid-50s. And what you can see is, historically that goes up and down. The shaded years are recessions. The employment to population ratio falls during recessions, rises during recovery. However, I want you to draw your attention to basically early 2000s peaks of business cycles, which is similar to the early 1990s, which isn't that different from the 1980s, that during peaks of business cycles, roughly about 89% of these men 25 to 54 work. That number currently, as of last month, is 86.1%. So while the labor market is improving since 2012 or so, the current level of employment to population ratio is below where we were in 2007 and well below where we were in 2000. And if you add all up these numbers, we're talking about 1.5 million men between the ages of 25 and 50 aren't working today relative to the early 2000s. Now, how do you reconcile that with the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate only measures those people who aren't working but who are actively looking for a job. So there's a large set of people who aren't even looking for a job in this 25 to 54-year-old range. Most of this decline is what I want to refer to as on the extensive margin. What do I mean by that? These people are retrenched from the labor market. So I'm going to show you a picture here. And this picture here is measuring from government surveys, the same one that measures the unemployment rate, and ask people, did you work at all last year? And if you said, no, I did not work at all last year in the prior 12 months, that's what I'm tracking here. So if you go back to 1985, 1986, about 8% of men with a bachelor's degree or less than a bachelor's degree, okay, that's the top line, so people with less than 16 years of schooling, about 8% of them said, hey, I didn't work at all last year. That number increased slightly to the 2000s, such as in 2000 about 12%. Then that increased almost up to 20% during the depths of the Great Recession, and is still now about 16% of less educated men with less than a bachelor's degree, report sitting idle from the labor market for a full year. That is a large number, much higher than it was in 2007 and much higher than it was in 2000. Here's the same pattern for women. I break out men and women in some of my analysis when I'm talking about these issues, just because women had such a long trend of entering the labor market for the prior century. But a couple things I want you to focus on with women, again, between the ages of 25 and 54. Notice that for the first time, decade over decade, from 2000 on, women's labor force attachment, their employment to population ratio, declined relative to the previous century. For the previous century, almost every other decade over decade pattern for women had them entering the labor force. The employment rate was rising relative to the prior decade. A little dip in World War II where women entered and then retrenched after. But now you can see women have declined, not huge, but by about 0.8 percentage points between 2000 and today in terms of their labor force attachment. And again, that's about 500,000, just a little under 500,000 prime age women. One thing I'm going to show you just facts, and then we'll try to get into explaining them. What I'm breaking down here is the change in the employment to population ratio by different groups, measured by gender, age, and education. So I want you to focus on two of the numbers I've highlighted there. Again, these are going to be less educated men, less educated women. Again, by less educated, less than a bachelor's degree. Okay? And you could see, and this is the first column is for ages 21 to 30. And I'm going to include people in school. I'm going to show you some schooling patterns later on. I'm going to call those employed. So this is going to be not accounting for the fact that some of these people will be employed more in 2018 than they were in 2000. But this is the decline in the employment to population ratio for these groups. Young men who are less educated and young women who are less educated have declined their employment to population ratio by about 7 percentage points, a little less than 7 percentage points for the men and a little less than 6 percentage points for the women. That is a massive trend over a 20-year period for young people, including those who are going to school, sitting idle. For the bachelors and more for women, it doesn't look so bad, particularly for the older women. But for every other group, you're seeing declines in employment to population ratio, with the declines being higher for the young relative to the old, much higher for the less educated relative to the more educated, and slightly higher for the men relative to the women. This is a pattern we are seeing that is pronounced in the U.S. labor market through last month. These are through last month's statistics, despite the unemployment rate being at relatively low levels historically. So what is driving these patterns? And so I want us to think a little bit today about what is causing the decline in employment rate to be low today relative to where it was 12 years ago prior to the Great Recession and almost 20 years ago relative to the early 2000s. And I want in our mind to think about two forces that we're going to talk about. One is cyclical forces. The word cyclical, again, among us macroeconomists, just means moves with the business cycle. So when the economy is bad, employment to population rates are low, unemployment rates are high. When the economy improves, you see employment to population rates rising and unemployment rates falling. And so if you look at some of these patterns, you see the cyclical patterns that today unemployment rate is better than yesterday's, which is better than the day before, all the way back to the Great Recession. So there is cyclical improvement when the economy gets better. But what I want us to talk about today is not the cyclical forces, but the structural forces. And what are these structural forces? These are long-term, medium-run type of forces that hit the economy that could actually displace workers so much that they don't even look for a job. They just sit on the sidelines. And so we're going to try to distinguish between cyclical and structural forces. And one of the things that are going to be important is the structural forces are long-lived and could coexist simultaneously with the cyclical forces. So when I'm out in policy circles and talking about the current labor market, and people say, look the labor market's fantastic. The unemployment rate today is lower than it was a year ago, and lower than it was 2 years ago. Things are great. And I say, yes, that is true. The cyclical forces are improving, but the structural forces still exist. And how do I know? The employment to population ratio is still very depressed for prime age workers relative to where it was prior to the Great Recession and in the early 2000s. And so we're going to talk about whether demand forces could be driving this, whether supply forces could be driving it, and why it might hit the low-skilled more than it hits the high-skilled, and why it might hit the young more than the old. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. Okay, and I've already said all of that. So, I want us to think a little bit about technology. You hear this in the news simultaneously. The labor market is hitting historically high success as measured by the unemployment rate. Simultaneously, robots are taking all our jobs. So how do we have both of those forces going on together? Well, let's think about the role of technology and its effect on the labor market. And so how does technology affect the labor market? Well, I'm going to show you it affects both labor demand and labor supply. Let's start with the labor demand discussions first, and then we'll come back in the end and talk a little bit about labor supply. So how does a robot or new technology affect labor demand, the demand for firms to hire workers? Well, the answer is it depends on whether that technology is a complement with workers or a substitute for workers in the production function. So think about a firm having a production function, okay, educational services. New technology comes along, gives me PowerPoint and clickers. That might make me more productive than I was before. Back in the day, if you were here 20 years ago, I would be here with my overheads and my slides being put on manually. I strictly prefer this. And 20 years before that, it would have been me and the chalkboard all the way through. So sometimes technology is complements with the production of workers, and that makes us more valuable. And as a result, increases in technology might increase labor demand for the firms. They want more workers because the technology makes the workers more productive. However, sometimes technology comes along and is substitutes for workers. So we used to be in a manufacturing plant, and the workers would kind of rivet the tires onto the car. And now a machine comes along and does that riveting for you. The new technology in that case is a substitute for the workers. So increasing technology could reduce the demand for labor for certain types of workers if those workers are substitutes with the technology. And so when you start thinking about the labor market and how it responds to technology, it's key to think about whether the technology coming in is substitutes or complements with workers. And it might depend on what type of workers we have in the economy. And I'm going to show you some statistics later on that certain types of technologies might be displacing lower skilled workers and being complements with higher skilled workers. And that's why you could get patterns of declining demand for lower skilled workers at the same time, and higher skilled workers are doing relatively well. So this is basically just anybody who's ever, taken an economics class. I'm just putting it in space now. If you had a demand for workers that is downward sloping, that's going to be the downward sloping line. That's basically just says when workers are cheap, firms want to hire more of us. That's what a downward sloping labor demand curve says. Upward sloping labor supply curve is the other line. That basically just says when wages are high, all else equal, you and I want to work a little bit more than when wages are low. If technology is substitutes with workers, that could be decreasing the demand for labor. We should simultaneously see falling employment for the group for which it is a substitute, and downward pressure on wages. And we haven't talked about wages yet, but you know from reading the newspaper that wage growth has been relatively stagnant in the US for the last 20 years. How do you generate low employment rates with stagnant wages? Declining labor demand. Okay, and that's what we're going to be thinking about as we go along.